Hey, welcome everybody. I appreciate you all attending. So as Jake said, I do own a business called Mentorship.CLUB, and that's designed to give people access to multiple mentors. But what I want to do is talk a little bit about my background and how I started the business called Mentorship.CLUB, because it's important, because the whole reason I started is how I started is because of my background. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that, and then we'll get into talking about how I got my first mentor and then my multiple mentors, because that's going to talk about how you get a mentor and then how you get multiple mentors. And then also that's going to talk about why that's more valuable to have multiple mentors than one mentor, and how it has the impact on, how it had the impact on my career and how it will have the impact on your career. I am honestly the luckiest man in the world, and I want to talk to you a little bit about that. My mom was a drug addict and an alcoholic. And I don't know what your ages are, but clearly you're younger than I am. But she took all of my brothers and sisters. So my two older sisters and I were born in 30 months. So we were right smack together. My younger brother was born 4 years after me. So she took us to live in a place called Watts, California. Now, you all might know Compton better than Watts, but it's all in the same area within a couple miles, South Central LA. Not a good place to live. In fact, at that time, it was the worst place to live in the country. And a lot of bad things happened to us at those times. My mom used to take us to bars together. We used to attend sex and drug parties. I never even told my story just until last Christmas. So even my best friends didn't know my story. But, you know, we experienced sexual abuse, incest. My mom's boyfriend was into child pornography and that kind of thing. So then my father eventually came out and brought us back to central Pennsylvania, which is where we were raised. But any of you who know central Pennsylvania, particularly if you're a boy or a man, you don't go to the doctor unless you're bleeding from the eyes or the ears. So at that time, I had muscular dystrophy, I had type 1 diabetes, but I even had an aunt who said, this child has diabetes, get him to the doc, but I wasn't bleeding from the ears, so my parents didn't take me to the doctor. So eventually I ended up having some ramifications. I didn't get diagnosed until my early 20s. So I had, severe neuropathy. I eventually needed a kidney transplant. And then later on, I had a pancreas transplant. I have high blood pressure. I had a couple strokes. I had a couple heart attacks. I'm going to be legally blind in a couple of years. So one time I said to a buddy of mine, well, at least I don't have cancer. The very next week, I got a call from my doctor that said I had cancer. I have osteoarthritis in my back and my knees. I just had knee surgery. Then all of a sudden, unexpectedly, I went completely deaf in my right ear. The docs have no idea why. And then, to be honest with you, probably from the time I was about maybe 14 until I was 46, which is when I had my pancreas transplant, I was completely suicidal. And my pancreas doc, who's down in the bottom of the slide there, told me that every single person who has a pancreas transplant, after the pancreas transplant, their thoughts of suicide go away. So I've talked to Knock about that, and he's really a good friend of mine today. He's right now trying to identify either the enzyme or whatever it is that you get once you have a pancreas transplant that eliminates those things. So I was very lucky because I'm able to kind of accept those things and move on. However, the only thing I was not able to accept was the fact that I was gay. I didn't come out of the closet until I was 48 years old. And then even after I came out of the closet, I didn't accept the fact that I was gay for about another year later, which I think is kind of interesting. I could accept all those other things very easily, but I couldn't accept the fact that I was gay. However, I would never let those obstacles get in my way of achieving some goals. So I was so lucky. I got a scholarship to study abroad. I lived in Mexico for a year. And in 3 months, I had no accent. I spoke like a Mexican. So to talk to me on the phone, you would think I was Mexican, but obviously to look at me, I'm so white, Casper looks tan next to me. But at that time, I had no accent. I won 3 state championships. I was selected by a Fortune 500 company as their top national recruit, which even today shocks me. I did not have very good grades. And then as my professional career went on, I was personally mentored by some of the best business minds in the world. My first personal mentor was the CEO of DHL. My second personal mentor was the CEO of Colt Manufacturing. My next business mentor was the man who founded a company called W.R. Berkeley, who's an $8 billion a year Fortune 500 company. Then my next business mentor was the co-chairman of Ernst & Young. And then eventually I became the CEO of a public company at 39, based in Philadelphia. And I was only one of 10 people who became a CEO of a public company at that time. So one day I was sitting in my office just thinking how lucky of a guy I was to go from living in Watts, Compton area to becoming the CEO of a public company at 39. So I made a list of CEOs that I knew, and it even shocked me. It was like 250 CEOs. And one of the things that's really important to me is diversity, virtuality. So we do this virtually. We can do it across the globe, and many of our mentors are from all over the place. So there are people like Luis Araña, who's really a very good friend of mine. Well, they're all friends of mine. Luis is a CEO of one of the largest third-party logistics companies in Latin America. Stephanie von Wadsdorf, who, by the way, was the first person I came out of the closet to. Her and her husband are very good friends of mine. Pardon me. She started a company called Fig.com. And then Jerry's the former CEO of Logitech. So as you can see, even there you can see some of the diversity of those people. So for example, Jerry's daughter's gay, and she's an author right now. And so say, for example, if you're going to start up a company in the fashion industry, one of the things that we have, you can see in a second, but you click off boxes that align you to a mentor when you can ask a question. So if you're going to start up a business in the fashion industry, Steph would be a likely person who would answer that question. So if you ask a question, it's not going to go to Ron Fidzikowski, who's one of the 100 best CIOs in the country. It's going to go to Stephanie. It would also likely go to Vicky Cantrell. Vicky's a very well-known person in the fashion industry, in the retail fashion industry. It would also likely go to Catherine Petralia. Catherine lends money to startup companies or to any company that needs money. She was also voted by Forbes magazine as one of the 100 most powerful women in the world. So those are the kinds of mentors that we have. So when you take a look at why we're unique in the industry, we vet our mentees. So when you apply, there's a vetting process that we have, and that's critically important to our mentors and why we can have the best mentors in the world, because we're very protective of them. And as I said, you also click boxes so we align the questions to the appropriate mentors. And that's also one of the reasons that we are able to attract and retain those kinds of mentors. And they really are the best mentors in the world. This is the only place that you can get unprecedented access to these quality mentors. And then we're going to talk more here in just a few minutes, but why having multiple mentors is so critically important to the kind of success that I think people are looking for. And we're going to talk here in just the next slide about the difference between mentors and coaches, because I think that's critically important. So when you take a look at coaches, and there are bazillions of coaches out there today, you can be a housewife and decide you want to become a coach. The reason you can do that, you get kind of formal training to become a coach. So there's no qualifications that you have to have in terms of education or anything like that. You can just become a coach. You get formalized training to become a coach, but you can become a life coach. You can become any kind of a coach. But it's very similar to like a teacher or an academic, except for the degrees that you need. It's like more book smarts or that kind of thing. They're also compensated to become a coach. So that's another difference you have between a coach and a mentor. It's also something that's performance-based. So for example, if you take, I'm a sports guy, so I played tennis very competitively, I wrestled competitively. So when you're looking for a coach, you're looking to increase your performance. So you have to learn how to hit a forehand or a backhand or a serve or something like that. So you have to learn the basics, how to hold the racket, or how to use a single hand or single leg takedown or a double leg takedown. Sorry, it's just like how I do things. Or how to calculate a formula or something like that, the basics and performance. That's very different in terms of coaching versus mentorship. Oh, also, it's also limited in terms of its time value. A mentor, it's very different. You don't have formalized training to become a mentor. It's a proven executive who's already had experienced some of the things that you want to experience. It's more like street smarts versus academic smarts. They're typically not compensated at all. So for example, none of our mentors are compensated. So for example, coaches, when you look at coaches, typically a website might have coaches are available, but you're responsible to select the coach. And that website is compensated based on somebody who chooses a coach. So they're like a brokerage house for a coach. That's not what we are. We just provide the coaches and we match you based on the questions that you ask with the coach. And we have really world-class coaches. It's developmental based. So if you want to develop your skill sets, that's where you use a mentor versus something else. And it's really limitless in terms of its value, because you're developing your skill sets, not your performance. So if you look at wanting to develop your performance or your basic needs or your basics performance, that's when you would use a coach. If you're really looking on your development and you already have performance in line, that's when you would use a mentor. I think that's really a critical difference between coaches and mentors. So I want to talk about how do you get a mentor? And I will also talk about my personal experience about how you get a mentor, because I think this is one of the biggest questions I get asked all the time. How do you get a mentor? It's a question that is not the easiest question to answer, I think. So I will talk about my personal experience, and really, I think this is the answer. The most important thing, I think, how to get a mentor, and a lot of companies have mentorship programs that are now starting to roll out. The first thing you have to do is exceptional work. Not good work, exceptional work. And I can tell you from not only a CEO's perspective, but also as a worker's perspective, exceptional work gets recognized, not only by your manager, but by that person's manager and on up the ladder. I can tell you as a CEO, when we had people down in the trenches do exceptional work, I would become aware of that, because we even had a list of high performers in our company that we would review on a monthly basis. So, and maybe many of our employees did not know that, but we would constantly review our high performers. And that meant down to the supervisory level. So if people did exceptional work, I would know their names. But the first thing, they had to do exceptional work, not good work, exceptional work. The second thing that's important is you have to be willing to be wrong. So for example, people who are really very good, we all have egos, but you have to be willing to be wrong. That's another important thing. I think when you're willing to be wrong, we all have egos. And so you're not going to achieve the position of vice president or president or COO or CEO without an ego. But your ability to be willing to be wrong also gets recognized. So I think that's also important. The other thing is you have to be willing to challenge authority, but you have to do that. So that's sometimes tricky. So you have to do that, but be very professional and respectful. It's okay to challenge authority, but you have to do that within the confines of respectfulness and professionalism. And I can tell you, people who challenge authority get recognized. If you do it the wrong way, you get recognized, but not in a good way. But if you do it in the proper way, it's recognized on a very positive basis. And that, I think, goes along with humility. You've always got to be humble. There's a song that Tim McGraw sings. It's called Humble and Kind. That's really one of my favorite songs. And if you haven't listened to it, you should probably listen to it. Listen to that song and listen to the words. It's such a powerful song. But I think that crosses everything you do in life. And it also talks about being confident but not cocky. And that is a pretty strong line in between those two things. And even if you watch any competition show on television, and I don't care if it's RuPaul's Drag Race or if it's a show, what was it called, where it was like this blue collar people doing work. There's a difference between confidence and cockiness. Be confident, but just not cocky. All those things will pay off. And then what I find, and what I find happens in many companies, is a mentor will find you. A mentor, somebody who takes an interest in somebody, I think you'll find that happens over time. And sometimes it's a slower process. A mentor will come and talk to you. They'll start talking to you. And sometimes it doesn't happen overnight, but you'll find somebody will come and they'll talk to you and they'll start talking about your performance. And they'll talk to you about specific things that they have noticed about your performance, something that you have done. They'll say, hey, Sally, I heard about some issue that you did with that customer. That was really pretty exceptional. Can you tell me a little bit about that? And you'll find, beg your pardon, you'll find that they'll use inquiry, which is a much stronger tool than advocacy. And what I mean by that, they'll ask you questions. They won't talk to you and they won't say, hey, what you did there was good. They'll say, can you tell me a little bit more about that? Why did you do that? That's inquiry. They'll ask you questions about that. And when they do, they're looking to extract information out of you. That's a sign of a great leader. The other thing is, if that doesn't start to happen, if somebody doesn't start to approach you and ask you that, and by the way, that's a sign of a great organization when that happens, then it's incumbent upon you to let it be known that you're looking for a mentor. And what I would strongly suggest there, and look, I'm sorry if somebody's in HR, but I would start to make that known among some other executives as opposed to HR. And the only reason I say that is HR is a great department, but sometimes HR doesn't get that right. It depends on the HR department. So for example, in most organizations, not all, when they rank departments about the best to the worst, in most cases, everything I've seen, HR is not the least ranked department. Purchasing is the least ranked department. The next to the last is HR. So I would make it known first among executives, but then if that doesn't even work, then I would go to HR, because sometimes you have formal mentorship processes in place. So that's how I would go about getting a mentor. First, do exceptional work, be willing to be wrong, be humble, challenge authority in the right ways. Don't challenge them just to challenge them. Challenge them if they make a comment and you disagree with it. Make sure you have your facts in place when you do that. Be confident, and then a mentor will approach you. Now, I want to talk a little bit about what I had learned from some of my great mentors. I was so lucky just to have one mentor, but I'm going to talk about what I learned from each of my mentors. I was just so fortunate. Bruce Edwards was the CEO of DHL. I was just so enormously fortunate. Bruce and I both grew up in the quality improvement process, and that's everywhere from SPC, and you probably none of you know what that is, statistical process control. That was headed up by Edward Deming. He started to roll that out to the manufacturing industry here in the United States. Nobody wanted it. So he eventually took that to Japan. And you probably don't know this history, but Japan's manufacturing used to be the worst in the world. So, but that's when Japanese manufacturing went from terrible to outstanding, because Edward Deming took that quality process over to Japan. And that's the process where he would identify with lines, not non-conformance, that's really Crosby, but defects. And you would constantly move the defects line down. So you had to stay within a certain range. That was statistical process control. And then that went to Crosby, who was really more geared towards service industry, which the goal was 0 defects. So you didn't measure how good you were, you managed how bad you were. So you managed to 0 defects. And then re-engineering, which was headed up by Michael Hammer out of MIT. And I was so fortunate, I even got personal training from Michael Hammer himself out of Boston. So Bruce and I both grew up in the quality process. I learned so much about strategy from Bruce, sophisticated strategy. So I remember one time we took the top 80 managers, and I was fortunate enough to be one of those, where we went out to a strategy session. And then in addition to that, Bruce and I also shared, we both played very competitive tennis. And in the strategy session, we ended up both in the finals of the tennis tournament. And so The other thing that we shared in common, we were both very competitive guys. Bruce knew I didn't care about his title. I was trying to win. He didn't care about my title. He was trying to win. Well, that drew us even closer together because we both knew that we were both very competitive. And in business, competition was king. I mean, I don't care. In business, I'm going to try and win. Fair, but I'm going to try and win. That drew Bruce and I even closer together. The other thing was I learned so much about leadership from Bruce. And not only that, but we also got great training at the company. We trained formally about leadership. Well, then not only did I get the formal training, but I tried to put it into practice. Bruce and I would have lunch and talk about that and talk about how we put that into practice. The other thing I learned so much about was the sales process. At Excel, who was the predecessor to DHL, I learned so much from Bruce about integrating. When we went into a sales process, if it was big enough, we would take IT, the person who was going to run the business. We didn't have sales just toss it over the transom and have the sales guy sell it. We would take other functional areas with us. So for example, we sold, the biggest deal in the company's history at that time was to sell P&G in Mexico. I was fortunate enough that I was going to run the business and then eventually manage all the business in Mexico. I spoke Spanish fluently, and so I delivered a piece of the presentation in Spanish. We also included IT. We also included, so we had operations, me, the guy who was going to run the business, who delivered the piece of business in Spanish. We had Bruce, who was really the CEO at the time. So we took a whole team in there. Not only did I learn from that, I implemented that whole process at the company I was the CEO of. And I learned the huge importance of training. So not only did I learn how to interview for people at Owens Corning, but I learned a different way at Excel as well. And then I incorporated that into all of my future learnings or future practices. So then I went to SDI, where I was the number 2 guy, and then I worked with Ron Whittaker. What I learned from Ron Whittaker was so different from what I learned from Bruce Edwards. Ron was a turnaround CEO, a well-known turnaround CEO. What I learned from Ron could not have been more different from what I learned from Bruce Edwards. Ron taught me not to make friends, and so did Bruce Edwards at the same time. Ron taught me not to make friends at work. He was very selective about who he would make friends with because he knew he was going to fire a lot of people. One of the first things Ron did was he met with everybody, the top guys, and he said, his first question was, who should I fire? And he made that list of people. And if he got very common names, he immediately fired those people. That was a huge learning for me. Then in addition to that, he was so focused on the top priorities. Now, it's not that they never changed, but they rarely changed. He stayed very focused on his top priorities. He would also just cut to the chase. He was a no BS kind of a guy, very focused and no BS. He was a great guy. Made a lot of tough decisions and quick decision making, very decisive. And you have to be in a turnaround situation. You absolutely have to. And then we went to a process we called fix or kill. We identified all of our contracts and we identified, are they financial issues or operational issues? And then what we did was we said, we either going to fix it or kill it, which meant if it was an operational issue, we got the right people in there and we either fixed it or we killed the contract. Same thing with the financial piece of it. We either fixed it, we met with the customer and either fixed it or we got rid of the contract. So we went from $500,000 in revenue to about $250 million in revenue. And by the way, our stock price doubled in that same period of time, even though our revenues got cut in half. He was a great guy. I loved Ron Whittaker. I still love him. I just talked to him last week. Then I went to work for Bill Berkley. Bill Berkley was the chairman of the board. Bill started a company that is now an $8 billion a year Fortune 500 company. And again, the skill sets that Bill had and the learnings I got from Bill were so different than Bruce and then Ron. You can't start a company from scratch and create an $8 billion a year business and be a turnaround guy or be a quality guy that learned the business from a quality point of view. You have to have a little bit of both of those things. But what I learned from Bill was about risk management. To start up a business, you have to be all about risk management. Plus, Bill was in the insurance business, which is all about risk management. Some of the important things I learned from Bill, understanding that his business was a public business and I was running a public business, part of it was about, a lot of it was about when you're running a public business, you're managing from quarter to quarter. Everybody wants to know how much money do you have at the bank at the end of this quarter? What are your revenues at the end of this quarter? What is your gross margin at the quarter? What's your ultimate net income at the end of the quarter? So one of the things I would discuss with Bill all the time is managing to the quarter versus making the decisions that are the best long-term decisions for the company. And one of the things I learned from Bill, and if you take a look at his stock price, his company's WRB. Take a look at on the New York Stock Exchange. If you take a look at Bill's stock and the performance of his stock, it is unbelievable. So one of the greatest things I learned from Bill is not only do you have to keep an eye on the quarter-to-quarter business, but you ultimately make the right long-term decisions for the business. And if you looked at our stock, in probably about 5 or 7 years, our stock increased by 5-fold, something like that. The other thing I learned from Bill was how to manage the board, because that's also critically important in a public company. So one of the things he taught me was not only how to manage the board, but also how to deliver messages to the board, and also to have them drive towards asking questions that you're prepared to answer. And that came after a board meeting where I did not do that. And I kind of got, not crucified, but I did not have a great board meeting. So after every board meeting, Bill and I would meet. And this was after a board meeting where he gave me a book called 1,000 Places to See Before You Die. And I asked him if that had any additional meaning. And then he said no, but then he did give me a lesson about how to drive and how to word the board and to structure the board books, so I would drive them to ask questions for which I was really prepared to answer the questions. The other thing I learned from Bill is how to do things immediately and not put them on to-do lists. That was another critically important thing I learned from Bill. The other thing was really to listen to Bill. There were two hires I made. One was a CFO, and the other was a vice president of operations. I felt so much pressure because I had a lot of pressure to make those two hires. He told me not to hire those people, and I hired them anyway. And those were two terrible decisions I made. Then lastly was Bob Neary. Bob was the former co-chairman of Ernst & Young. So obviously, these were more of a financially based learnings that I got from Bob that were really great. I did not spend as much time with Bob because he was the chairman of our audit committee. But I, again, learned a lot about risk management, and obviously that's from a financial point of view from Bob. The other thing was the critically important checks and balances that you have to learn, particularly from a financial or from a public company. The other thing was conflicts of interest, which we ran into. So one time we ended up having one of our audit companies refuse to do our books. We really ended up in a huge problem. And then the other thing I really learned from Bob Neary was a lot of times where you stand depends on where you sit. And this happened one time where we were at a conflict where I stood at one point at one position, and the board stood, or the vast majority of the board stood in a different position. Or I'm sorry, not the vast majority of the board, but Bill stood in one position and I stood in another position. And Bob had taught me that. And there were 3 times where we stood separate. I mean, I always got along great with Bill, but there were 3 times where Bill took a position and I took a separate position, and we had to vote on it. And I'm very pleased and proud to say I won 2 of those, which for me was huge victories. Now I want to talk about how those, and the reason I set that up is how having those multiple mentors had a huge impact on my career. Any one of those mentors would have been huge for me. And particularly the quality of those mentors would have been huge for me. But not only did I have such a well-rounded set of skills that I developed because of the kinds of mentors that I had, but it expedited my learnings dramatically. So not only did I get access, because I did business globally, but not only did I get access to those experiences on a domestic level, but also on an international level, and it expedited my learnings tremendously. I lived outside of the United States for 8 years. I not only was bilingual, but I became multicultural in such an expedited way in like a few years. I became the country manager of Mexico when I was 29, and I became the CEO of a public company, which was only at 39, which I was only one of 10 people in the country. I never would have gotten that experience if it were not for those mentors that I had. So that's kind of my story and what I would suggest to you all. So with that, I'd like to open it up for some questions if you guys have it.
Awesome. Thank you, Don. Yeah, anyone feel free to make use of the chat, or also please feel free to come on camera and ask directly. We do have one question from Tracy here. Could you please explain more about the board questions that you had mentioned?
What do you mean the board questions?
So how do you kind of put your board book together to make sure that they're asking the questions that you want asked? Tell me a little bit more about what that looks like.
Yeah, I'll answer that in two ways. First of all, when I first became the CEO, I called some of the board members. This is kind of a funny story. I called some of the board members and I asked them what they liked about Ron's book and what they didn't like. And then, so I called, say, 3 of the board members. The next thing is my phone rang and it was Bill Berkeley. And Bill's not one for small talk. And he just said to me, I talk to the board members, you talk to me. And I said, well, nice to see you, Bill. I said, I was just calling the board. He said, he interrupted me, he goes, I talk to the board members, you talk to me. So he did not want me to talk to any of the board members at all. So
That's
that was
hard.
the first thing. So exactly, I see you now. So he would not even allow me to talk to the board members. So there were occasions where some of the board members would call me. So then that kind of left it up to me by myself to put together the board books. So what I did was I talked to Bill a little bit about that, but he was not much to give me much information. So when he talked to me about that, he was really referring to me about the errors I made at that one board meeting where I didn't position some things in the way for which I had the answers. So that was very specific to that board meeting. So he just used that as some examples and then said to me, here's some of the ways that you could position that. And it was really around a specific instance where we were going to bid on a piece of business for New York City. And what I had done was I had completely changed the strategy of the company, where we used to, the old strategy was our value proposition was, we'll buy all of your inventory. So we'll take bad assets from your books and put them on our books. And we would just trust you and buy it at the price that you say it is. And we'll buy them and put them on our books. So we'll just transfer a bad asset from your books to our books, and we'll buy 10% cheaper than you. So I put together a new strategy where we would say, we don't care about buying your assets. We won't buy your assets, but we'll manage your inventory, and we invest in this new industry disrupting technology. We won't buy your inventory. And what we'll do is we'll use this technology to manage your inventory, and we won't buy your inventory any longer. The way I delivered that message was not as succinct as I just delivered it, as I delivered it to you. And they asked a bunch of questions, and I just was not prepared to answer it succinctly. And so he and I talked through that. So that was an example of where I was just a little ill-prepared to answer the question.
All right, we have another question in the chat from Rahiv. Says, hello, everyone. How do you find mentors? I've worked with EY and Accenture.
Well, it's like I said, what'd you say, Rahiv?
Yes. Yep.
It's like I said, Rahiv, the first thing I would do is make sure you do exceptional work to get noticed. And then the second thing I would do is there are some things you can do, like challenging some authority, as long as you do it professionally and respectfully. Those two things will start to get you noticed up the ladder. Now, in companies like E&Y and Accenture, they're a little different than some other companies. So you've got to work things differently than that in some cases. So you know the companies better than I do. I know E&Y a little bit, I know KPMG. So I know some of those companies a little differently. So you've got to do those things. And then the other thing I would do is, particularly with those companies, I would talk to some of the partners, and you know some of those personalities certainly better than I do. I would select some of those guys and, you know, talk to them and tell them you're looking for some mentors and ask some questions and get some of their feedback. So those would be the two things I would do. I'd make sure you do some exceptional work, challenge some authority professionally and respectfully and appropriately. And then I would talk to some of the partners and say, hey, I'm looking for some mentorship. Do you have any suggestions on how best I can do that? Those would be the three things I would suggest.
Great. And Don, I had a question of my own.
Yeah.
In the companies that you started, have you ever instituted a formal mentorship program, or do you think that's something that's best to just kind of happen organically?
I'm sorry, in the companies that I started?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. So, well, clearly what I do is I started a couple little companies. I always have a mentorship program. Always. I never go without one. And what I do is, obviously I have it formalized. I've never had it not formalized. We always identify a high performer list. So that is inside the company, we always identify our high performers. Not only do I do it internally, but I also have an external mentorship program. And I'm just so lucky because I know so many people. So, and the reason I think that's important is because I see a lot of big companies. So for example, DHL is a great example. One of the things that you do when you have just an internal program, sometimes people feel a little intimidated by just having an internal program. So if you're in a company like DHL, sometimes you may have questions that say, hey, I'm thinking about leaving. Well, you don't feel comfortable talking to somebody inside your own company about possibly starting your own company or leaving the company. So that's why I always would have an internal as well as an external mentorship program.
Awesome. Awesome. Oh, okay. We have another question here from Rahiv. Sorry, a couple of questions. I got bumped here. My cousin is an MD. He is trying to raise money for a drug company. How do we find venture capital?
Okay, that's a gret question. There's a couple of different ways you can find venture capital. If he's an MD and he's looking to raise money for what kind of a company is it?
It says drug.
A drug company. You can look for strategic money, which means if it's a drug company that's, say, looking for painkillers, you can look among other MDs who use those kinds of drugs or are very familiar with those kinds of drugs. That's probably the easiest money to raise because there are people who are already familiar with that kind of drugs. And they are also people who know those kinds of drugs. So for example, I know a company right now that is looking to raise money for knee braces. And they've really got this outstanding product. They've got patents on it. In fact, I have it right now. I use it. I'm all about it. But they are looking only for money from osteo doctors. That's a great way to raise money. So the same thing would apply for that drug. It depends on how much money they're looking for, obviously. But that would be the first thing. The second thing would be to identify PE or venture money for people who are really focused in that area. And there are certainly ways to look for money that way. I'd be happy to help them if they want to shoot me an email. They can, it would just be Don Woodring at MSN would be a great email to use. But I can help them look for some money, for people who either in venture or in PE money. There are companies who just focus in drugs. So those would be the two best ways to do that.
Cool. And we have about a minute or so here, so time for one question in the chat. Have you had mentors who provided you different advice, and how did you navigate that?
That provided me different advice? What do you mean different advice?
I assume perhaps Tracy can tell me if I'm reading this wrong. Maybe two mentors approaching the same issue, but giving you different angles on it.
Conflicting advice?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I don't think I ever had conflicting advice. I can't remember ever getting conflicting advice.
Cool. All right. Well, we're right on time. So thank you, Don, for sharing both your personal life and professional. A lot of amazing insight here. And I'm going to put a link to our next session that's going on right now. It's our on-ramp session, building and launching a product. But yeah, Don, thank you once again for all of your insights today. Really appreciate your time.
Well, thanks, everybody. I really appreciated everybody's attendance and questions.
Awesome. All right, everyone, enjoy the rest of your evenings, and we'll see you next time.